Live. It just made me go live. Okay, computer. So hello and welcome to Insurrection with Brenton Lengel. For those of you who don't know me, I am your host, Brenton Lengel. I'm a former activist with Occupy Wall Street, and I'm also an anarchist and a Ringo-nominated comic author. And I do a lot of debates. And I'm joined here by Pogan. Pogan, I have just become aware of you and your content, and I subscribe to your channel. You just had a debate with Destiny on Modern Day Debate about a week ago, and I watched it. I caught it. I didn't catch it live. I watched it immediately after, and was basically chewing the stuff around my computer. So first off, by the way, was this your first live debate? Because I didn't see any others on your channel.
Sure. So I've been in these like Discord debate circles for 2 or 3 years. Most of them aren't recorded or televised or anything like that. There was one debate I had with an individual named Canadian Catholic on Modern Day Debate about atheism versus theism. But that was the first like political economic debate I've ever had of that size for sure. And it was like a really, really huge opportunity for me, obviously, because Destiny has a massive audience.
Yes, he does. Because I was about to say, one, for your first debate, if it had been your first debate, you did really well. Also, two, you jumped in with both feet immediately going up against Destiny.
Right.
I've debated him myself, and he is tough.
Yeah, he's very rhetorically effective, very, very good with rhetoric. Yeah, I think his strongest attribute is like thinking on his feet. He comes up with questions to ask his opponents like really quickly.
He does. He also has a way of controlling the debate from the very beginning. I think part of it is because he is as famous as he is, but also just the way he tends to react. He sort of puts you on the back foot even when you probably shouldn't be, or at least he did that to me in our debate. We debated morality, which I enjoyed. So first off, for the people in my channel, they might not be as familiar with you. So do you want to introduce yourself to my audience really quickly?
Sure. So I'm Pogan. I make videos about politics, economics, current issues, that sort of stuff, usually from a leftist perspective. I identify as a market socialist, but to give myself a hard time, I like arguing for the hard theoretical stuff like command economies, things that are more difficult to defend in most situations. I'm over at youtube.com/c/Poganist. Twitter is the same thing, twitter.com/Poganist. I upload pretty much every day, and subscribe if you enjoy that sort of stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, and I was pretty impressed with what you had with your performance in the debate. Now it was a while. It's been a while since I've watched it, but some stuff really jumped out to me. I will have some questions for you, and kind of give you a little bit of my input on the debate. But because it's been a little while, I wanted you to first like kind of lead off and just what was going into this debate, like how did you feel about it going in, and like where do you think like you hit your stride in the debate?
Sure. So the thing that I've noticed about Destiny talking to leftists is they're usually from the standpoint of like very broad, very overarching political themes, like how do we implement this system? How do we get people to come to our side? What is like the end of capitalism look like to you? How does a factory work in socialism? Those are the sorts of conversations that Destiny usually has with leftists. What I don't see talked about by Destiny or any of the big debaters, including like people like Vosh who talk about socialism a lot, are the pieces of economic nuance and the actual like economic theories that Marx espoused, right? So a big one that came up in the debate was the LTV, which doesn't get a lot of airtime because it's very complicated, very nuanced. But the point is, Marx, first and foremost, was performing an analysis of capitalism, not making prescriptions about a subsequent system or giving like some blueprint plan for socialism. So when people say they object to Marxism or they think Marx was wrong or they say Marxism is false, to me, that always feels like them equivocating on what that is, right? Talking about, say, communism instead of talking about his actual analysis of capitalism, which is what I wanted to not only talk about, but I wanted to talk about with somebody like Destiny to kind of expose a large audience to those sorts of ideas in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and do you think you were successful with that? Because, and by the way, I don't mean for that to sound like a hostile question. I genuinely want to know how effective do you think you were at getting that across?
Yeah, so I think I explained the theory a little, pretty well overall. I think maybe could have used more like layman terminology, a little less technical jargon. But as far as like introducing people to the LTV, introducing them to some of the concepts, talking about the theory very broadly, and then explaining exactly how Marxism is an analysis of capitalism, maybe dispelling some myths about that, I think I did pretty well overall.
Yeah, I think you definitely did. And this was really great for me. So I come from an anarcho-communist background, anarcho-syndicalist. Like I've had my head in Spain. I'm actually I have a comic series coming out soon about the life of and death of Buenaventura Durruti, which I'm really excited about.
Sure.
And you know, so I originally got into leftism first by arguing about anarchism online with a guy who was an anarchist when I started arguing with him, and then gradually became a Marxist and a Maoist, and then eventually he became a professional economist, which was really exciting for me. And so he's kind of like my he's sort of like my ringer. Whenever I'm about to have like a big economics discussion or debate with somebody, I usually go to him and be like, hey, does this make any sense?
Gotcha.
Yeah. So and you know, that was just like well before like forums, you know, that was like on web, that was before web 2.0 on like the old, like, you know, PDBB or whatever the hell they were called forums.
Right.
You know, so what I found very interesting about these debates, and I was someone prior to this who was very much on the right, you know, red-blooded American male. And it took me a little while. Like what I realized going into these discussions with anarchists was that I didn't know what anarchism was, and that if I were to argue effectively against it, I would need to learn about it. So then I learned about it, went back, won the argument, and then like 2 years later, I was like, ah, crap, they were right the whole time. So, you know, I think these debates, a lot of people, like, I think there was a video that came out recently where they were saying that like debate bros are useless and these debates don't do anything, they don't change anybody's mind. One, I'm living proof that they do change people's minds, but two, I think what people are not understanding is they expect like a debate to go down where you debate the person, you either totally own them or you persuade a whole bunch of people in the moment. And in my mind, these things tend to be more dialectical and more about getting ideas out into the zeitgeist as opposed to directly converting your opponent, which is almost impossible to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the debate bro thing is pretty weird because it operates from this assumption that like what's going to dramatically change somebody's entire political view is one debate or one conversation, which is absurd in my opinion. But what it can do is, one, like I said, it can expose a good number of people to an idea they maybe didn't consider fully before or didn't look into deeply. And then second, if we're talking to maybe like a conservative or something absurd like an anarcho-capitalist or a fascist or a reactionary, you know, the bad people, the debate may not change their mind instantaneously, or they may not come out of the debate saying, I'm a leftist now, but it may be the start of the domino effect, right? That may be enough for them to look into the issue themselves, talk to other people who identify as leftists, basically get the ball rolling for them to eventually change their opinion. And the point is, those two things alone make political debates worth it, right? There is a space for political debating. There is importance to political debating. We can't just constantly do, PhD theses and lectures and seminars, because there are people who want a little bit of a theatrical element to things, and that's how they learn. That's how they come into contact with new concepts.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. And so that was one of the reasons why I think your debate with Destiny was one of the more effective ones that I've seen, because you did, I think you introduced an understanding of Marx that I am seeing now reflected even in like LeftTube that wasn't there before. Because the thing is that, you know, a lot of radicals on the left don't actually do the reading. Like it's one of the most frustrating things. And so it is really good that you were able to bring that level of specificity, because I mean, Marx is hard to read. Like he's dense and German and, you know, if people do read Marx, they mostly just read like the manifesto and then nothing else, or there are a couple of quotes from Das Kapital. So it was really nice to see you guys arguing about that. Now, there was a point in the debate, and this one was something that I really wanted to get on it. Like, as soon as I saw the thing, I was like, oh, I got to get this guy on my channel. Because you were actually talking about something that I like to harp on in economics when I have economic discussions, and that is marginal utility, which, despite Destiny calling himself a marginalist, Destiny, I'm sorry if you're watching this, you don't know what marginal utility is.
Right.
And it's I understand that, because it's a very difficult concept to wrap your head around. And also, like, the way it is described online, like if you go to the Wikipedia, it makes almost no sense. So it took a while for me to understand this concept. And whenever I run into like an ANCAP, say, who's talking like they know economics, I'll be like, oh yeah, okay, explain marginal utility.
Right. And
of course they never freaking can, like, because even if you immediately Google it, you're not going to figure that out immediately. So you used like the famous like diamonds versus water thing, which is that's what they have up on Wikipedia and stuff. So do you think at any point in the debate, do you think you started to get through to Destiny with this definition? Was there any time after the debate? Because I've noticed there's a number of times where one of the things that he's very good at is acting very sure in the moment of what he knows. And a lot of the time he's wrong. A good example being in my debate, I had made an appeal, like I'd put out Gödel's incompleteness theorem and Russell's paradox as examples as to why axiomatic systems are either incomplete or contradictory. This relating to morals, and he said in the moment, he was like, "I would bet my life on it that no one uses naive set theory anymore." And even me, I'm not a math guy, but I knew about this stuff. I was like, I don't really think so. I don't think that's correct. And of course, after the debate, I went and looked it up to make sure. And if you've ever used a freaking Venn diagram, you've used naive set theory. And I felt like there was that where he's calling himself a marginalist. He's giving off the impression that he knows about these things, but the depth wasn't there. So first, at what point in the debate did you realize he didn't understand what marginal utility was? And were you able to actually express the concept to him effectively, do you think?
Sure. So unless I'm misremembering, there is actually a part in the debate where, after we go back and forth on marginalism and marginal utility for a little bit, he says something to the effect of like, maybe I just don't understand marginalism, which to a lot of people that came off as like him being charitable, like basically saying, maybe your understanding is just different from mine. But I think perhaps optimistically, Destiny just sort of came to the conclusion that some of the economic like premises that he takes for granted when he talks about capitalism or defends it from attacks by socialists or Marxists are just things he takes for granted, are things that he really hasn't looked into the criticisms of them or the critiques of them. So I don't have the expectation that Destiny reads 6 books on marginalism and like develops his understandings to the level of a PhD economist. Not that I'm one either, right? But I do think if you are going to talk about theory, if you are going to talk about economics, right, it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that you at least have basic concepts like that in mind, right? Because like you mentioned anarcho-capitalists, I've been on Discord, I've debated long enough to know that like they at least understand things like marginalism enough for catchphrases, right? Like, oh, that's not what, like when talking about Marx, they'll say, that's not what value is, referring to things like marginal value, marginal utility. So I don't think that expectation with Destiny is unreasonable at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, do you have an economics background, or is that did that come into it just as a result of your political work?
So I have no formal economics background whatsoever. I'm actually in school for medical biochemistry, which is pretty far removed. But in terms of like academic interests, politics and economics are the top two for sure. They're the things I love learning about the most, talking about the most. To the extent that I've thought on several occasions of just changing my major to economics.
I would stay in the medical biochemistry because I think you'll impact the world in a much more positive way through that than economics. Also, fun fact. So my friend, who shall remain nameless, who was not a PhD, but he was in a graduate econ program, graduated I think like a master's or something, and is currently employed by like a major financial institution.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing. When he went into that institution, like he had to lie because the school that he went to actually gave him like a questionnaire which for this graduate program was like, have you now or are you now or have you ever been a member of the Socialist Party? And like, now granted, technically he was telling the truth. He was never a member of a socialist party, but he was a socialist. He considered himself a Marxist. And if he'd answered yes, they wouldn't have accepted him. Wow. Now this was a major state school in the United States. The economics like departments across, I can't speak for every school, but like I was employed at a major financial school, like with mostly economics majors and account majors and business majors and that kind of thing. And I remember I walked up to an econ professor. This was during Occupy Wall Street, and I'd heard this quote from Marx about how the change of price in one commodity in a market alters the price of other commodities in the market. So the price of silver goes up, the price of silk falls, vice versa. Right. And so I went up to this econ professor that I just happened to know, and I asked him, I said, hey, so Marx said this thing. Is there any, and this was literally my question to him was, is there any objective scientific evidence for this to be the case? And he didn't answer my question. He actually looked at me for a second and then told me to read Milton Friedman, which was funny, by the way, because then years later I debated Milton Friedman's son, Dr. David D. Friedman, who's a lovely person, though I disagree with a lot of what he has to say. Yeah. But like, so like, econ departments, especially in the United States, are very far to the right. And that's even leaving out stuff like the Austrian ones that are funded by the Koch brothers. But anyway, my friend, when he explained marginal utility to me, he didn't use the Waters versus Diamond. This is one of the comments I wanted to make because that one gets people really confused a lot. And I might suggest in the future a better way of explaining this, because I was like, after trying to understand like the Wikipedia on it, I went up to him and I was like, dude, what the hell is what is marginal utility? Please explain this to me. And he's like, the difference in utility of one more of a unit. And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And what he said was, he started to do the diamonds versus water, and I just kept getting confused. And he was like, okay, forget the diamonds and the water. Pizza. You have one slice of pizza. Great. 2 slices of pizza. Wonderful, even better. 3 slices of pizza. Okay, getting a little full. 4 slices of pizza. Okay, 6. Why am I doing this to myself? Yeah. So, like the big thing with the marginalists, in my understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, was that they essentially disproved LTV, and I don't think they actually succeeded in disproving it, by proving that the utility of the same unit altered depending upon how many of them you had, and therefore utility could not be expressed within an objective theory of value. Now, I think utility is different than value, so I don't think that's 100% correct. But I mean, that's really was like the big marginalist revolution, why they thought it disproved socialism. I don't think it disproved socialism.
That's straightforwardly on the part of the marginalists. That's straightforwardly equivocation, because when they're talking about value, with respect to marginal utility, the pizza example is great, by the way. Good. they're talking about value reflected in market prices. They take it that market prices are an expression of economic value. So the reason why, to take the pizza example, the reason why like a slice of pizza would decrease is because you've already eaten 6 of them. That's reflected in the market price of a slice now being lower. But Marx isn't talking about market prices. He's not talking about value in the sense that it would be immediately reflected in a market economy. When Marx is talking about value, he's talking about commodities just having intrinsic value because of the fact that they were worked upon. There was labor put into them. They were made into commodities because of the labor time that somebody spent turning it into a commodity. That has a correlation with market price in his view, but it is not one and the same. So you, in theory, could be a marginalist and an advocate of the LTV. Those two things are compatible. And I pointed this out to Destiny in the debate. The only problem is if you want to run like the ECP or the local knowledge problem or any of these like supposed objections, you must first assume marginalism, because that's what those objections depend upon. And I basically got into a conversation with him where I wanted him to defend marginalism, which he couldn't do. So it kind of calls into question like these so-called defeaters of socialism and things that prop up market economies necessarily. Not to lampoon Destiny, he seems like a very intelligent person. I just think like fundamentally people often misunderstand the theory behind these sorts of things, the economic concepts that play into these objections a lot of the time.
Yeah. Well, no, I think they totally do. And the thing is that Destiny is kind of doing that thing that people do in like forums and on Facebook when they have arguments. Like, I mean, at least for me, I'm a kinesthetic learner. So I learn by doing. It's one of the reasons why I love debates. It gives me an excuse to, if I've got a strong opinion on something and I want to learn more about it, I'm more likely to actually go and learn more about it if I'm going to debate somebody on it, or if I think that I might want to debate someone on it. So like, I think like Destiny kind of fronting on knowledge of marginal utility and calling himself a marginalist, that's something that I could see myself doing in a forum. And then somebody calls me and I'm like, shit, Google.
Yeah.
You know, and it's something we all do. And sometimes people act like this is some giant sin. And I really don't think it is necessarily, though I will say there is something about there is an inherent problem when that is not simply an argument like within a forum in a small community, but projected to hundreds of thousands of people, like with regard to Destiny's audience. And I will agree with you. I think he's incredibly intelligent. He and I had a really good debate, actually, and I would love to actually debate him on the state again, and possibly I really want to get him because he says he's a determinist, and I'd love to tackle determinism. But
sure,
to pull it back, I think to the like the debate that you guys had, and I correct me if I'm wrong here, because I right after I watched your debate, I watched his debate with Richard Wolff, and I might be equivocating the two mentally. Also, you know, like I said, I've had my head buried in a Kickstarter fulfillment. But at the beginning of the debate, if I'm not mistaken, you made the point about the shrinking rate of profit. And I thought that this was a really, really good point, that I was aware of this, but like I haven't seen socialists make this point, and it is a really, really key, very important economic point that I think is not brought up a lot. So could you talk a little bit about that, why you opened with that, and how effective you think that argument was in the debate?
Sure. So the reason I led with that, and I'll go into an explanation of it and the evidence for it in a second. The point is, and this is why, like I say, you can be a capitalist and a Marxist. You could advocate for all sorts of economic theories and be a Marxist. Marxism is at its core just an amoral scientific analysis of capitalism. You can think it's wrong, but it is not the one in the same as communism, nor is it one in the same as socialism. And the proposition was Marxism versus capitalism, right? Yeah. Not Marxism, not communism, not socialism. Yeah. So in leading with that, I'm basically saying something like, okay, look, we have this economic theory, and it's making a prediction that rate of profit over time declines, and it approaches zero. And when it hits zero, right, we have every reason to believe capitalism as an economic system is not sustainable, because you need profit in order to sustain capitalism, right? So what do you think of this prediction, right? Why would you think this prediction is wrong? What do you think of the possible explanations of the prediction? And of course, the prediction that rate of profit declines until it hits zero has to do with profit relative to the capital invested. It's a ratio, right? Profit to invested capital. The point being, as labor becomes more productive, capitalists can't extract as much profit from laborers, so there is less profit return for capital investment, right? That's the entire. Yeah. That's the idea. But I again, it harkens back to what we talked about previously. I didn't want people to think socialism or think communism in the scope of the debate. I wanted people to think, is what Marx is talking about with respect to capitalism, is what he's saying will happen to capitalism, are his economic prescriptions, so to speak, borne out? And if you don't think they're borne out, then why do you think capitalism is sustainable in the long term? So that's kind of the context I was running with and how I set it up in my mind.
Yeah, which is great because that also puts Destiny on his back foot, because then he doesn't have to just attack Marxism, he has to defend capitalism.
Right.
The problem, however, is that because capitalism is the prevailing economic system now, there's this implicit assumption that it works, even though, I mean, have you looked outside lately?
Right. Nobody in feudalism thought feudalism would ever collapse, right? So
yeah. Yeah. Now this is so. This was something that I actually really wanted to make sure got brought up, because you mentioned that it has to hit the rate of zero, and I actually don't think the profit rate has to hit zero for capitalism to essentially melt down and become untenable. And that's because of another thing of capitalism that I don't know if Marx was aware of, but we are aware of now in 2021, which is the fact that capitalism requires infinite growth. Mm-hmm. And not only just infinite, but it needs to I compared in a debate that American Johnson of Non-Compete and I did against two SocDem liberals, was that a capitalist economy is kind of like the bus from Speed. If not, except it's actually worse, because the bus from Speed, it couldn't go below a certain thing or the bomb goes off. But this is like Speed. If not only can the bus not go below the speed, a certain speed, and the bomb goes off, the bomb also will go off if the bus doesn't continuously speed up. And that's really what we see when it comes to capitalist investment, and one of the reasons why it's so volatile. Because if ever the rate of profit simply slows, well, the freaking investments dry up, and you get an economic crash, and the rich take their money and hole up in their gated communities and wait for a sunnier day. Meanwhile, paychecks bounce, businesses are destroyed, people lose their jobs, and suicides go up. So this system that we have, if we have an infinitely shrinking rate of profit, which we seem to have, I don't think Destiny at any point contradicted that, and I haven't seen any economic data that contradicts that. And we have the need for infinitely growing profits. We are basically at a system that is going to inevitably melt down unless we either find some way to solve these two problems or jump to a better system. And I really like that you came at it in that technocratic way, because I feel like that kind of approach, where we're talking about capitalism like it's a broken machine, like it's a buggy computer, is going to play very well with Destiny's audience, particularly because of Destiny's kind of scientistic outlook that you'll see in the ways he talks about morality, for instance, and the ways that he talks about a lot of things. I feel like that argument is going to appeal to them much more than arguments that specifically focus on the plight of the worker, for instance.
Yeah, I agree. I actually wouldn't stand by completely the claim it literally has to be zero.
Yeah,
of course, that's obviously not the case. But what is the case is exactly what you just said. There's a quote by, I think, Rosa Luxemburg that says, "Capitalism begins to collapse not as any consequence externally, or not because of any attempt on it made by another system, but rather because of its own increasing productivity of labor." Right. And what that means is, as capitalists try to undercut it, you basically laid this out, as capitalists try to undercut each other, compete, expand, they always need additional profits, additional revenue to engage in those sorts of measures, which means they have to extract more profit from laborers, which they cannot do ad infinitum, right? There is a certain point where you can no longer extract profit from workers, or it's just too low relative to the ratio, relative to capital investment. So you're correct. From a purely scientific perspective, the system is not sustainable economically. There will come a time where things begin to unravel. And then I think I said this in the debate. The only question is do you want a system that benefits the greatest number of people, which is what I would advocate for, or do you want to take the Weimar Republic route and let the fascists take over and run things in a highly totalitarian, highly authoritarian way? And I would hope unless he has some reason to think the tendency is false, which he clearly doesn't. Destiny's not saying it's acceptable for fascism to arise out of capitalism. And that's the important part, because that means, like, for as much as he defends liberalism, for as much as he defends capitalism, if he thinks we should have a worker-owned successor system, the point is Destiny's a socialist. That's all it means to be a socialist. You can talk about revolution, reform all you like. There are obviously variations of it, but fundamentally, that's what it means to be a socialist. That's what that's the outcome you want when capitalism begins to unravel.
Yeah, no, and I'll agree with you entirely. And I think that this is something that normies don't really understand, because one, fascism is very difficult to wrap your head around.
Right.
I'm one of the few people that, for the most part, gets it, and that's, again, because I've had my head buried in freaking Spain in the 1930s, and I've done deep reading on this obscure history that almost nobody has.
Right.
But like, fascism kind of arises directly as a tendency as capitalism breaks down, and essentially you get two choices. Like Derrida famously said, there's two roads here. It's victory for the working class and freedom, or the victory for the fascists and tyranny and barbarity. Like, both combatants know what's in store for the loser. And essentially what happens is, as much as we may want to avoid this, and as much as liberals may want to continue the status quo, ultimately, when capitalism is no longer serving humanity in the way that it needs to make sure that the bills get paid, to make sure that the food is and the resources are distributed to enough people, once things start to break down, and either society can find class to build around, to build their new system around, in which case socialism, or they decide to build around nationality and race, and that's frickin' fascism.
Right.
And, as we've seen with the Trump administration, but also with just about every fascist thing, fascists it's clown shoes too, because fascism isn't a real ideology. It's almost more of an aesthetic.
Right.
So, like, I think that's a really important point to make. But I also wonder if there's a base level of education that the average viewer simply does not have, and cannot understand this particular point. Because, again, it took me a while to wrap my head around that. I mean, do you feel like that? But also, there's been a little bit more education about fascism with the rise of the and fall of the alt-right. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think I would agree, and it's hard to say that without coming off as elitist. Like, I read a lot of stuff, but I'm not Isaac Newton over here or anything. I'm just some guy. The point is, like, the working class always is and always has been the largest and most powerful economic class in pretty much any modern society. And when the working class is ignorant, when the working class is unfamiliar with the political circumstances or economic circumstances that they exist in, it works to the advantage of, we'll say, aristocrats, the aristocratic class.
Yeah.
This is why in the Weimar Republic, as the Weimar Republic slowly began to unravel and collapse, when German business owners basically colluded with the fascists, it wasn't because they thought fascism was fantastic, and this extends to the propaganda given to the working class. It wasn't because they thought fascists were fantastic. It's because the other option was socialism, or at least what the German communists wanted, and that was directly contrary to the profit motive. So in that sense, I see fascism almost as an extension of capitalism, and I think fascists, hopefully you would agree with this, they almost prey upon the ignorance of everyday people. Like strongmen populists like Donald Trump, they're not exactly constructing bases out of educated elites or people familiar with political theory. They're constructing their bases out of disenfranchised workers who are upset with the current system. They're seeking an alternative, and they see an alternative in somebody like a populist, somebody like a strong man who promises them a better future, who promises them a greater tomorrow, without really getting into any of the nuance or exact policies they have in mind. For them, given their anger towards the status quo, it's sufficient for somebody to just say, I have your best interests in mind, follow me, or you face destruction, or God forbid the communists take over, or something like that.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think I agree with you 150%. Though also I will notice, especially in modern fascism, but I think this also tracks with historic fascism. It's not just the working class, but it's also the disaffected middle class as well tend to cleave to fascism pretty hard. And you saw it like with the January 6th beer gut push. Where like so many of those QAnon people were like Ski-Doo salesmen.
Yeah, right.
You know, like, so it's, and I don't mean to, you know, if you're a salesman, if you're a small business owner, you know, I'm a small business owner myself, like that's one thing, but you don't let your ignorance get taken advantage of by freaking fascists, because one, even they will not be able to deliver what they promise, and then eventually all it comes down to is force and murder. And that got dark. So my thoughts with you. So where do you think you did the best in the debate, and where do you think you could have improved on your performance?
Sure. So I think the best part of the debate was definitely just explaining the nuance of like the LTV. Like basically, at a certain point, I felt like I was giving like a thesis or a dissertation to his audience, and I thought that was the best part, because at least I'm like educating some people. Maybe like a couple people walk out of this thinking, okay, well, I need to do some reading. That's ideal. That's the ideal outcome. The worst part of the debate was probably when he started asking for quote unquote practical real world examples of the LTV. And understandably, I expressed confusion. I was like, I'm not really sure what you're asking. It's kind of outside the scope of the theory. It's analyzing capitalist production. It's not saying like, this is how a small business would work, or this is what happens at the point of exchange. But optically for Destiny, that's a very good attack, because what it seems like to him and his audience at that point is like, this guy's just talking in fairy tales. This guy's just saying, hey, here's this random scientific theory that might have a couple interesting points, but why spend any time learning about that when we have economic theories that work and apply to everyday exchanges, which is, of course, outside the scope of the LTV.
Yeah,
but at the moment,
outside the scope of marginalism. Marginalism does not do at all what he thinks it does.
Right. But the point is, like, optically, that comes across, even though hopefully most of us know better, optically that comes off as, like I said, you're just talking in fairy tales. You're using like some random 200-year-old German book to try and like talk about things that are no longer applicable today.
Yeah, and he's very good at that, and he does it a lot. It's when I do think Destiny is a good faith debater for the most part, but also I think that the hold on his mind that liberal ideology has is pretty strong, and any attempt to break out of that is going to be painful. Like just the level of cognitive dissonance you have to deal with. Again, it's very weird. Just thinking back to like how I was thinking when I was 18 versus, you know, how I'm thinking, you know, now that I'm nearly 40. Oh God, I'm getting so old. And how slow that process is of kind of figuring out this, and the radicalization process as well, the emotional stuff that comes with that. A lot of it is very, looking back on all of it, I would say it's painful, it takes work, it takes time, and it takes effort, because there's a lot. He is particularly invested in not seeing a problem with capitalism, because one, he's doing very well under capitalism, so there's no incentive for him to change with that, and two, you know, once you realize it's kind of like, you know, you don't want to go to the doctor because you're afraid it might be cancer, you know. So as long as you can deny that there is a problem, then really there's no problem. It's not a logical outlook, but you know, people don't make big changes in ideology a lot of the time for necessarily logical reasons.
I think that actually extends to academia, like especially economic academia. I think whether they like to admit it or not, and maybe this comes off as conspiratorial, but oh well, I think there's almost this sentiment in academic economics, and Destiny is an extension of this, where it's like like you said, I don't want to go to the doctor, because what if the problems that I'm experiencing are not just like minor lifestyle changes? It's instead stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and I'm very quickly going to die, right?
Yeah.
Like if that's the scenario that academic economists and to a lesser extent Destiny have to deal with, the debate isn't like nuanced liberal reforms anymore. The debate is, how do we prevent like a catastrophe? How do we prevent severe immediate declines in quality of life for a majority of people when the system does collapse?
Yeah.
And that's a conversation people understandably like to avoid. Nobody wants to talk about those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a great example, honestly, is global warming.
Right.
Slash climate change. I mean, we've known since the 70s, like that, yeah, this is happening and it's going to cause possibly something close to civilizational collapse. And,
Right.
you know, the oil companies that, and I think you might have even brought this up in the debate, actually, that the oil companies, unless I'm thinking of something else, which I might be, you know, their own scientists were telling them in the 70s, this is happening, we need to fix it. And instead they did their best to, even though they believed it, deny the science publicly and shore up their own infrastructure against stuff like rising sea levels, because they knew it was happening. They believed it was happening, but the profit motive, you know, and a lot of times I think people think that when people talk about the profit motive, that like it's like people just sitting there made mad by privilege and power, like plotting over brandy with cigars about how they're going to steal all the money from the poor people. And that's less of an issue. I think there are probably people like that. But more of an issue with regard to the profit motive is you've got a giant, especially in the case of like a whole economy or a corporation, you've got a giant engine full of people that depend on it to make sure that their bills are paid, to make sure that these products are delivered. And you've got a huge problem that seemingly can't be solved. So, of course, you push the thing down the line and you try not to look at it and hope that something will come along and save you, as opposed to doing the really hard work that will then, you know, unfortunately cause major societal disruptions.
Right.
But, you know, at the end of the day, that's also that's very Pollyanna thinking, and it very well could lead to total global disaster if something isn't done. So, like, my question to you is, if you're talking to somebody like Destiny, or just to a liberal or whatever, how do you think the best way to get them to understand this problem is, and to break through that sort of like social conditioning? Like, what do you think the give me the golden key? Fix ideology for me in like 5 minutes.
Sure. So, especially recently, I've been interested in like pragmatic policies, like everyday things that improve people's quality of life. But I like to sort of like contextualize them within the grander scheme of things. And what I mean by that is, you say something like, okay, look, here's how we can benefit workers now, but just understand this is a Band-Aid. This is not fixing the problem. The problem still exists. All we're doing with this piece of legislation or this policy proposal or what have you is temporarily improving people's quality of life. And that's kind of how I operate on Twitter, and especially recently in some of my videos. I'm not saying like, just read theory, bro, forehead. You don't need to talk about like actual politics. You do need to talk about actual politics. Obviously, like some things are better than others. We don't want Trump, right? That's absolutely reasonable stuff. But you always have to be, and it gets more widely accepted the bigger the chorus is, and you're starting to see this with like the DSA, the Overton windows shifting left. Even sock Dems are better than the status quo. The point is, like, I would hope the reason things are starting to shift left politically, broadly, is because there is, at least on some level, people starting to get this like tick that something is off, something is wrong. And they're trying to put Band-Aids on things, and the Band-Aids are good, right? They improve quality of life, but you see more and more people, as the left is starting to grow in popularity and notoriety, which it is, basically come to the conclusion that we need to start thinking about what happens after the Band-Aids, right? There are too many bullet holes. The patient is bleeding out, okay? We need to do something a little better than putting on like a Band-Aid and saying good luck with your life. right?
Yeah.
This analogy is starting to break down. The point is, I think there is greater consideration for like what to do in the future when capitalism ultimately breaks down. And maybe for people like Destiny or liberals who are just maintaining the status quo, you say something to them like, do you just think all these people are insane? Do you think they're all wrong? Every single one of them is wrong. Do you think Marxian PhD economist Richard Wolff is wrong? Do you think the growing number of economists talking about these problems are wrong? Like, what perfect question for him would be something like, what do you think explains immense dissatisfaction with the system? And why has it increased so dramatically in the last few decades, you know?
That's a really, really good point. And that's a good one to use on a liberal. Unfortunately, you use that on an ANCAP, they'll say it's government. But
right, yeah.
That's all right. I argued with ANCAP so long, I fought the final boss. So,
right.
But yeah, so real quick, by the way, because you said you had 45 minutes, I don't want to keep you too long. I really appreciate this, by the way. And I'd love to have you back on the channel again sometime. Because this was really stimulating. So real quick, there's a couple of questions here. So this one, I'm going to go with this one, the first one from Antonio in my chat. Destiny likes to demand unreasonably specific and simple answers to questions whose answers are all gray. Yes. Is this your experience, Antonio? Because it definitely was mine.
Yeah, I would agree. I think
not Antonio. I'm sorry, Pogan.
Yeah, there's an example of this in the debate, and he's mentioned this to other leftists where they'll be talking about things broadly. They'll be talking about theory, maybe just like in general what the political prescriptions are. And he'll go from listening to somebody talk about the basics of socialism, the core tenets of it, to describe how a factory works under socialism in very specific, very nuanced detail. Yeah. That's important, right? That's fine. But it's almost like a tactic. It almost seems like if that's not what you're interested in, or if you don't have like a perfect blueprint for that sort of thing, you've failed, or the system can't be, or there's like some contradiction with the system, which of course isn't the case.
Yep. Well, not just that, but also even if you give him a perfect answer, he can just spin it as basically catastrophize it and be like, this is so complex, it's so theoretical. I'm sorry, it doesn't work. And I noticed that in his debate with Richard Wolff, where he was asking for things that could not be even provided by capitalism. And it's similarly like his question to you, where he was like, yeah, show me how LTV works in the real world. And it's, like LTV, at least to me, and you can tell me if there's a deeper understanding of this, because again, I'm not as concerned with LTV versus STV, because I see that it is completely beside the point in the sense of an argument about exploitation. I don't care what actually gives it value. Workers are getting screwed over and people are being hurt. So let's figure out a way to fix that. But, at the same time, I think it's very important to have this robust theoretical framework and for people to understand it. So my understanding of LTV, and this goes back to, I think, the way Adam Smith described it, is that value is created by labor in the sense that you have raw materials, salt, and meat. And a worker comes and takes the meat, the raw materials, the meat and the salt, adds them together, makes salted beef. And then the difference in price between the salted beef and just buying regular beef and salt on the market is the value that's been added. And that's the argument for exploitation being that the classic socialist one, that the surplus value that is extracted by the capitalist from that is actually being stolen when what it belongs to is the worker, since the worker is the originator of value. Now, is my understanding of LTV correct there? Because I don't see how that.
That's basically spot on. Yeah. The basic idea is that what is bought and sold on a market is a commodity. Mm-hmm. And there is a subjective expression of desire for that, which we call market price, but that's not what Marx means. What Marx means is there's a certain amount of labor that goes into the creation of a commodity. We call it socially necessary labor time, right? Mm-hmm. And the actual value, and you got this correct, of a commodity is just an extension of that socially necessary labor. So when a socialist says something like, capitalists are taking the surplus value from workers, what they're saying is a commodity was produced, right? And value is generated from that labor. The worker only got a portion of that. The rest was kept as profit. which is your understanding is basically spot on.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, because like you hear a lot of really dumb objections to LTV. You brought up the mud pies argument, but I remember there was an ANCAP that thought STV was disproved by really expensive baseball cards. And like, you know, oh, how can one baseball card be worth $1 million when another baseball card that looks the same and came out of the same factory is worth $1? And that has nothing to do with the value. The value in LTV, the value of the really expensive baseball card was still created by the labor, as was the value of the less expensive baseball card.
Exactly.
So I felt like Destiny seemed to think, and I've noticed he thinks about this a lot because this is how he thinks about moral systems, in that it's like a machine that you can feed data into and come out with a conclusion. And I objected to this framing entirely. And he seemed to think that LTV and STV, or marginalism, were, again, machines that data could be fed into, and comes out ways to make everyone rich. And it seems to me that these are much closer to... I mean, do you feel like it's closer to a natural law that's being described, or do you feel like it's closer to philosophy? What's your feeling there on LTV versus STV? Like, how does that interact with what Destiny wants, which is essentially, you know, economic theories like behavioral economics or something?
I think it's definitely more philosophy. I think it's just basically two different interpretations of how capitalism works, right? Mm-hmm. That's fundamentally what it breaks down to. Which is why it's so frustrating when people say things like, oh, well, the LTV is disproven by like baseball cards being thousands of dollars, right? It's very narrowly, the scope of the theory is the productive forces of labor in capitalism, the capitalist mode of production, right? If you try to invoke these like weird examples like baseball cards or mud pies or a lemonade stand or what have you, you're just talking outside the scope of the theory, right? Like you wouldn't offer as an objection to, say, physicalism or determinism, right? The fact that I'm currently thinking thoughts, or, you know, the fact that there could be like other universes, because that's just outside the scope of what the theory is trying to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it, and I will probably try to do that next time I'm arguing with a really frustrating person. So there's one more question I had from the chat, by the way.
Sure.
And no socialist, according to the person in chat, no socialist has been able to answer this. So Pogan, I want you to answer it. And the question is, if you like socialism so much, why don't you marry it?
I'm in a committed relationship already, unfortunately. So socialism is going to have to find somebody else. Art. Thank you for the question, though.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so I think we're at the end here. We've gone a little over time. Do you want to plug your pluggables? Where can people find you? And what do you have coming up?
Sure. So I'm over at youtube.com/C, if I can talk, /Poganist. If you just search Pogan on YouTube, you'll find me. Subscribe if you like political economics content. I'm over on Twitter at twitter.com/Poganist. I do political commentary, economic commentary, lots of pragmatic stuff recently, like I said. Still talking about theory eventually. Coming up, I am working on getting in touch with Vosh to talk to him about economics. I'm also going on the Serfs Tuesday, April 11th to talk to them about Marxian economics and political theory. Besides that, I upload every single day, pretty much, barring the occasional break. So if I came off as like remotely interesting to you, there's tons of content that you guys have to look forward to.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me know. I'm in contact with Vosh, so if you,
Sure.
I can try to see if he wants to talk to you. He doesn't always answer me, but
Sure.
if you don't already have a contact line open, I can definitely see if I can open something up.
Absolutely.
All right. And for those of you guys who don't know me, again, I'm Brenton Lengel. I'm a former activist with Occupy Wall Street. I am the author of, among other things, Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, the comic series. The fourth Kickstarter is getting ready to launch as soon as I'm done fulfilling the third one, and it's driving me crazy. I do videos on philosophy, socialism, Buddhism, and art on my channel. And if you want to find out more about me, just Google my name, Brenton Lengel. I'm literally the only one in the world. I also I yell at people on Facebook. So this has been really, really cool. Well, Pogan, I do hope you do more debates on modern day debate, because you're one of the stronger debaters that I've seen, and I really, really liked your debate with Destiny. Your channel is linked in the bottom here, and then I'm also going to be sending it to James, and he'll link it hopefully at the bottom of the modern day debate of your debate with Destiny, so people will see the breakdown afterwards, and hopefully they'll come over here and learn about marginal utility.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, all right. So from me to all of you, this is Brent from Insurrection with Brenton Lengel signing off, and you want to say goodbye, Pogan?
It was good to be here. Great conversation. I'll probably talk to you very soon.
Absolutely. All right. And